On those cloudy days, Robert Neville was never sure when sunset came, and sometimes they were in the streets before he could get back. If he had been more analytical, he might have calculated the approximate time of their arrival, but he still judged nightfall by the sky, and on those cloudy days that method didn't work. That was why he chose to stay near the house on those days. He walked around the house in the gray afternoon, checking each window to see if any of the boards had been loosened. After violent attacks, the planks were often split or pried off, and he had to replace them, a job he hated. Today, only one plank was loose. Isn't that amazing, he thought. In the backyard, he checked the hothouse and its water tank. Both were undamaged today. He went to the house for his tools. As he entered, he looked at the distorted reflection of himself in the cracked mirror fastened to the door. In a few days, jagged pieces of the glass would start to fall. Let him, he thought. It was the last damn mirror he'd put there. It wasn't worth it. He'd use garlic instead. Garlic always worked. He passed through the dim silence into his bedroom. Once the room had been warmly decorated, but that was another time. Now it was entirely functional, and since Neville's bed and bureau took up so little space, he had converted one side of the room into a shop. He took a hammer and nails from the bench, returned outside and nailed a plank fast to the shutter. For a while he stood on the front lawn regarding the silent length of Cimarron Street. He was a tall man with a long, determined mouth and bright blue eyes, which moved now over the charred ruins of the neighboring houses. He'd burned them down to prevent them from jumping on his roof from the adjacent ones. He took a long, slow breath and went back to the house, lit another cigarette, and had his mid-morning drink. It was almost noon. Robert Neville was in his hothouse collecting garlic. In the beginning it had made him sick to smell it in such quantity. Now the smell was in his house and clothes, and sometimes he thought it was even in his flesh. When he had enough, he went back to the house and dumped them on the sink. As he flicked the wall switch, the light flickered and then flared into normal brilliance. A disgusted hiss passed his clenched teeth. The generator was at it again. He sat down with an exhausted grunt and began to separate the clothes. He reached over, took an ice pick from the rack, punched holes in each clove, then strung them all together with wire until he had 25 necklaces. When finished, he nailed them outside over the window boarding, taking down the old strings which had lost their potent smell. He went through this twice a week, and until he found something better, it was his first line of defense. Defense, he often thought. For what? All afternoon he made stakes, lathing them out of thick dowling. These he held against the whirling emery stone until they were sharp as daggers. It was tiring, and no matter how many stakes he made, he never seemed to get ahead. They were gone in no time at all. It was all very depressing, and it made him resolve to find a better method of disposal. But how, when they never gave him a chance to even think? As he lathed, he listened to Beethoven over the loudspeaker. It helped to fill the terrible void of hours. His gaze kept shifting to the clock on the wall. In another hour they'd be at the house again, as soon as the light had gone. After he'd finished, he stepped outside. The sky was darkening. He looked up and down Cimarron Street, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. That's what's wrong with these days. You never knew when they were coming. Oh, well, at least they were better than those damned dust storms. With a shrug, he moved back across the lawn and into the house to prepare his dinner, locking and bolting the door behind him. He stopped, his eyes moving quickly to the clock. 6:25 today. Ben Cortman was shouting, "Come out, Neville!" Robert Neville sat down with a sigh and began to eat. He sat in the living room, reading a physiology text while the music of Schoenberg played loudly over the speakers. Not loudly enough, though. He still heard them outside, their murmuring and their cries, their snarling. And they were all there for the same thing. He wished he had time to soundproof the house. Even after 5 months, it got on his nerves. He never looked at them any more. In the beginning, he'd made a peephole in the front window, but then the women had seen him and started striking vile postures in order to entice him out of the house. He knew he could put plugs in his ears to shut off the sound of them, but that would shut off the music, too, and he didn't want to feel they were forcing him into a shell. He closed his eyes. It was the women who made it so difficult. The women posing like lewd puppets on the possibility that he'd see them and decide to come out. A shudder ran through him. Every night it was the same. He'd think about soundproofing the house, then he'd think about the women. Deep in his body, the heat began. He tried to read, his lips forming each word slowly, but in a moment the book was on his lap. All the knowledge in those books couldn't put out the fire in him. All the words of centuries couldn't end the mindless craving of his flesh. The realization made him sick. It was an insult. All right, it was a natural drive, but there was no outlet anymore. They'd forced celibacy on him. He'd have to live with it. "You have a mind, don't you?" he asked himself. "Well, use it." He reached over and turned the music up louder, then forced himself to read a whole page without pause. He read about blood cells, about lymphocytes and phagocytes. He shut the book with a thud. Why didn't they leave him alone? Did they think they could all have him? Why did they keep coming every night? Above the noise he heard Ben Cortman shout as he always shouted, "Come out, Neville!" "Someday I'll get that bastard," he thought. "Someday I'll knock a stake right through his chest, a foot long with ribbons on it." Tomorrow he'd soundproof the house. He couldn't stand thinking about the women. If he didn't hear them, maybe he wouldn't think about them. The music ended. He could hear them even more clearly. He reached for the first new record and put it on the turntable, twisted the volume to its highest point. "The Year of the Plague" by Roger Lya filled his ears. Violins scraped and whined, flutes played weird atonal melodies. With a stiffening of rage, he wrenched up the record and snapped it over his right knee. He meant to break it long ago. It was no use. You couldn't beat them at night. He'd go to bed and put the plugs in his ears. It was what he ended up doing every night anyway. Quickly, trying not to think, he went to the bedroom and undressed. He looked at the ornate cross he had tattooed on his chest one night in Panama when he'd been drunk. What a fool I was in those days, he thought. Well, maybe that cross had saved his life. He jammed in his earplugs, and a great silence engulfed him. He lay on the bed and took deep breaths, hoping for sleep. But the silence didn't help. He could still see them out there, the white-faced men prowling around his house, looking ceaselessly for a way to get in at him. Some of them crouching on their haunches like dogs, eyes glittering, teeth slowly grating together. And the women. Did he have to start thinking about them again? He tossed over on the sheet, his face pressed into the hot pillow, and lay there, breathing heavily, body writhing. Let the morning come. Dear God, let the morning come. He dreamed about Virginia, and he cried out in his sleep, his fingers gripping the sheets like frenzied talons.